I was thinking of an argument that I would like to propose to the Lysenkoist. And the Lysenkoist is the person who ideology determines everything. And they will use the name of science because science is a word that means authority. And they will assert their ideology there, and anybody who disagrees with them gets the label of being categorically unscientific because it's not about actual science, which can be falsified, proven right or wrong, and has to be hypothesis based. Um, and it has to be testable, and there's certain thresholds. Instead, they deal in ultimatums because at the bottom line is their ideology. And the argument that I wanted to put forward is a question. And I think this, my assumption here is that the Lysenkoists, because their decisions are determined by ideology, they will have a certain assumption in one area of the conversation about society that will not translate to the other area, assuming that they had principles. And you would see the incongruence between those two assumptions and say, well, if you feel this way about this thing, and the principle is X, and you feel this way about this thing, and that's the same principle, it doesn't seem to translate. So how can you have an authentic opinion? And the way that I would challenge this is by asking, presumably, if you're a Lysenkoist, you believe that simultaneously these two things. One, that the system that we have in the United States is just racist. It's systemically racist in unspecified but very obvious ways. And we need undefined but very obvious interventions into diversity, equity, and inclusion. We won't define those terms, but if you ask for a definition, it means that you are being resistant and you are showing your white fragility, which is a Kafka trap. It is not real rhetoric. It is basically shut the fuck up and do as I say. That is an ultimatum that is given by the Lysenkoist. So they're doing it in the realm of race and saying that basically the government does not have authority and is illegitimate to the degree that it's systemically racist. Given that, this is what I would do in an argument. I would begin a conversation about, okay, let's assume that I believe everything you just said. And I say, yeah, we don't have authority because we're just so systemically racist here, and the government is abusing minorities and all this kind of stuff through the institutions. My question is, why does this same government have the authority to make medical and health decisions for everyone? I agree with you. It's completely corrupt and it's awful. Why should we allow these people to determine what goes into my body and what does what is the narrative that I'm supposed to believe? Because if I have my own opinions and I listen to different scientists who differ because, that's what scientists do, they try to falsify things, that is their responsibility. I wonder if that will translate to the Lysenkoist. Because ideology is first and foremost, and you basically show this fault line where it's like, if you believe this, and your remedy for that situation is to do this, that makes zero sense. Absolutely no sense. Do they immediately enter cognitive dissonance? Do they challenge you? Because I feel like the whole twist of the argument I'm making is like, okay, the system is corrupt. I agree with you, and therefore, this government and these institutions should not have any mandate over how I manage my family. They shouldn't be sending me social workers, and they shouldn't be forcing a vaccine on me. Because I distrust those institutions. So simultaneously, there's just this weird narrative that comes from more of the corporate media and also NPR, which is supposed to not be corporatized, but there's just this kind of obvious alliance that was actually admitted in a Times article where they said these people fortified an election, and they're just fortifying information, and they're just giving you very credible, they're protecting you from misinformation. Facebook does that. YouTube does that when you talk about certain COOFs and ailments. It pops up a little bubble and says, here's where you get the right information from the World Health Organization. and it's a little bubble, and you, I guess the point being, if you are so skeptical of these institutions, why should the United States, which is systemically racist, fund the World Health Organization to tell us what to do about this this ailment? And why do they have authority in doing so? At what point are we supposed to believe the institutions, and at what point are we supposed to say, no, you're corrupt, we don't like you, we don't like this? And how does that translate practically? Because to me, the Lysenkoist lives in an ideological dream, and all of the incongruences between this, incongruities, whatever, it's just like, okay, none of it matches up, which might suggest to a person paying attention that these opinions are socially expedient and politically expedient, but do not really tie to the rhetoric used to generate their legitimacy. And therefore, they are illegitimate. And by mashing all these things together, it should arise in the mind of this person that maybe my values are fake, and maybe my attitude to coerce people into believing and doing, allegedly believing, like you're forcing people to do things and say things that they don't believe. And when the person protests, there's a bunch of again, it isn't about principle. It's shibboleths. It's like, say this. Pledge your allegiance to science. That has nothing to do with science. Pledge your allegiance to science by agreeing with this. Pledge your allegiance to intersectionality by agreeing with this political agenda that's in all of these, basically being exported by all of these corporations, which if you are a Marxist, supposing the leader of Black Lives Matter, espoused Marxist, she has private property, a lot of private property. And the person that raised this in the public forum was silenced by a multinational corporation. And people that consider themselves, I won't use the word woke, but consider themselves to be, have these enlightened philosophies and attitudes that they came up with by themselves and totally aren't just social hand signals that people show each other to be like, oh yeah, I'm with the good people. You're sellouts. It's awful. It has an effect on society, and people that actually are thinking and that are asking questions, you can be like, oh, well, I have certain questions about this vaccine. I have certain questions about it, and I heard something recently, and it makes all of the things I've been talking about even more relevant, and I would like to kind of snap some of these Lysenkoists out of it and just be like, hey, this is going to have consequences, and I feel like when the rubber hits the road, you are going to take it out in your whipping boy, which is the person that was telling you that this is a bad idea from the start. Instead of listening to them or having a dialogue, it's just make an example of this person further. And that kind of willful ignorance, where you basically have these short-sighted attitudes about any number of social issues, and they don't even agree with each other, and they don't make sense. But instead of doing any thinking and sort of rectifying those narratives that are being sold to you by corporations, by the way, Mr. Communist, Mr. Capitalism is evil, these are being pushed by big pharma. This is being pushed by big, large multinational corporations. It's like, I'm so against corporations and capitalism. It's just like, well, I'm for them if I have the right ideology and I can just use these institutions, not these institutions, if I can make these corporations into institutions that everybody subsidizes through taxes, and it basically forces everybody to pay for this, even if they disagree. So there's no freedom of conscience. Increasingly, there's no freedom of choice, and it's all to spare the feelings of people who never really had their own opinion in the first place. They just listened to the experts, and they complained about conditions in which people were being manipulated historically. And it's just like, do you not see how ready you are to be manipulated now? Because you won't allow people to tell stories, to have debates, to communicate. Increasingly, you are throttling this, even to the point of forcing people to hide their faces. It's like, if there's anything that would have given you pause, but I will still extend maybe like a little, like, here's something that might give you pause. Just look at the ideas that you have. At what point can you draw any lines? And to any degree, is it your responsibility, especially if you're espousing this, or are you just going to be useful to this ideology and shrug off your responsibility and say, well, I didn't really have any power to affect these things anyway? It's just like, yeah, you did. Especially people that talk about, oh, here it goes, certain regimes that are historically of ill repute, and they use them as an example, and they say, well, weren't these a bunch of terrible people? Weren't these people like a negative? And then you use it as a pejorative to describe other people that are, you know, unreasonable. And it's just like, okay, well, let's take that. What sorts of behaviors did they exhibit that made them so unreasonable? They weren't debating people. They were using institutions to force people to do things and buy certain products and say certain shibboleths. You know, no longer saying hello, but Heil whoever, you know. I think there's certain parallels, but if you just identify as a good person because you speak the right shibboleths, the shibboleths of the happy good people, you don't really have, you're LARPing as a moral actor. You've basically given up your responsibility to have any informed decisions, and instead you just listen to where people are speaking from. They're speaking from a certain place, and therefore it's my responsibility to accept what they are saying uncritically. There's different ways in which you can, because not everybody's cut out to like understand everything. It's impossible. There are people that are specialized, and yes, you should listen to people who have invested time in understanding these various fields, and that should give them authority. But if you break down those structures so much, you say, these structures are racist and they're corrupt and they're useless and they have no authority. Okay, you're saying that. And at the same time, you're saying we need to trust people trained by those institutions. Everything is subjective. Everything is arbitrary. It's socially constructed. There's no such thing as objectivity. The idea of objectivity, falsifiability, scientific method, all of those are practices that give those people speaking from those places the authority that we ought grant them. If you are simultaneously undermining that authority because you are a Lysenkoist, and that's just what you do because it's all about ideology, that's very disappointing, because it's like you're basically just mouthing a lie. You're saying we need to listen to these people because they are speaking from the position of such and such. And it's just like, okay, but are they doing the things that make speaking from such and such important? Are they practicing those disciplines? And they go, you must be an anti-vaxxer. You must be a slur. And they just go into groupthink. They never leave groupthink. It's a disability, and a lot of people have it, and they just offload all of their responsibility of discerning things off to this. And there's certain people that are your whipping boys, like anti-vaxxers, which is adjacent to anybody that is Christian, anybody that is God-fearing, anybody who is, I mean, well, not everybody who has got, we'll get to, it's all political, and it's all temporal, and it's very short-sighted. And it has costs, and these costs are being exported to people that you are willfully labeling as undesirables. And the fact that you're willing to engage in that and say, he's an anti-vaxxer, he's a Nazi, he's a white supremacist, and it's just like, yeah, but it seems like those definitions expand to anybody who disagrees with this very accessible narrative, but there's some questions that should be asked. And if you're not asking those questions, then, or allowing those questions to be asked, then the authority that you are citing is not relevant. Plus, you've already made those arguments yourself, except it's in different social contexts. Again, saying that, all the institutions in the West are corrupt and they're racist and they're based on this ideology and blah, 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 blah. But at the same time, we need to listen to doctors and experts and people who study in universities. And it's like, okay, Can you at some point draw one fucking line between the arguments that you're making to make it a little more coherent? And they go, no, because as soon as you ask that question, it shows that you are not one of the Lysenkoists. You are not one of the zombies, the sleepwalkers, who want the calm assuredness of security that is not real. It's a fake. It's a false security. More particularly about the virus. Where's my beverage? I heard something interesting. There's this assertion that by having people vaccinated, so when you listen to the radio, you hear about all these variants that are popping up for the virus. There's new variants. So I heard this discussion, and they were talking about how by getting people vaccinated, they are using a system called adaptive immunity. I believe that is the term. And there is also innate. It's either innate or inherent immunity. I can't remember what it is. But young people tend to have very high innate immunity. And as they grow older, they rely more on adaptive immunity. And their innate immunity gets weaker. And this whole conversation about vaccinating every single person, every person needs to because of social pressures. That sounds unscientific. They go to the point where they're just like, if you aren't doing this and you're asking relevant questions about your own health, you're part of the problem. And it's just like, well, where do you get the authority to make that kind of ultimatum? But also, I think people have legitimate concerns. And one of those concerns is when you put this vaccine into the population, and there's various types of vaccines, and there's all of these variants that are happening because this is a living thing, it's not a machine, and the human body is not a machine as well. Basically, these people are interlopers, and they are injecting this very low resistance. It's kind of like a low-resolution picture of the virus, and it takes up all of these S receptors, and it bonds to it so that the virus can't get in, but it decreases the ability of the immune system to utilize its inherent immunity to adapt to new variants. So, in some ways, I'll briefly go to another example about how, and I feel like this has been a conversation for a few years, when people are talking about antibiotics used in different medical treatments, as well as sanitizing solutions that people use on surfaces. There is sort of an arms race. These are living biological beings, these viruses, and they adapt. They adapt to these treatments. And so when you intervene in such a way where how to phrase it, there's a natural immunity and a natural process that people build by interacting with their environment. And if you just use these hormones like they've been doing with livestock, you change livestock diet, and then they start having certain health issues, and then you just start throwing all these medications at them. They do the same thing with people experiencing depression and all kinds of stuff. There's many diseases of inflammation, which the people already experiencing any of these diseases are going to be more susceptible to this virus because something regarding inflammation. I'm just kind of stringing together words at this point. But I feel like there are legitimate concerns. Basically, the theory is that by introducing people to this very generic strain in an environment where we are dealing with a virus which very likely was engineered in a lab, the gain of function has been increased artificially, so it basically adapts as fast as possible. And by vaccinating a large number of people and deliberately injecting the virus into people, you're kind of incubating a certain form of it, and then when people respond to people's ability to respond to the variants is decreased by having been vaccinated, because something about those receptors the S receptors that bond to the cell, they've already been taken on by this adaptive immunity that comes from the virus, and therefore their innate immunity, which is the process by which people build herd immunity. And the details of that are a little fuzzy because I'm not really a scientist, but I did hear a scientist discussing this in greater detail with Brett Weinstein, and I can't remember the guy's name. He was a European gentleman. But anyway, that's just kind of the source of my concern. And it seems to trend. This concern trends with a lot of the agendas of the Lysenkoists, where we have to have a crisis, and because we have a crisis, that is the excuse, that is the casus belli, that is the legitimate reason why you should have an intervention. And we need to have an intervention, and we need to intervene here and here and here. But then you look at the history of intervention, where it's like, I feel like if I put it as like a snooty talking down on the West type mentality, that might translate to the Lysenkoists, where it's like, yes, you talk about holistic medicine in the East and how they relate the mind and the body and the spirit, and everything is part of one system instead of throwing pharmaceuticals at people. There's a problem with the West where everybody's over medicated. It's either pharmacological interventions or pharmaceuticals or whatever, and vaccines, and it does not respect how the body works, which is why it was a big shock when people were looking at antibiotics, and how we are kind of in an arms race where we have to develop new antibiotics because these living beings adjust, and we are part of a world that is living and breathing. It's not a machine. So if I put it in that way, maybe you'll be able to accept and sort of understand the objection to massively vaccinating a large number of people with a largely untested, at least for its long-term effects, quote-unquote vaccine that is unlike any other vaccines. There aren't any other mRNA vaccines that I'm aware of, and the distinction between them is lost on me at the moment. If I get any relevant information, maybe I'll put it on the channel or just put it in a link, but I feel like these are important questions to ask that we are not allowed to ask, because the second that I question the narrative, I become an anti-vaxxer, because the Lysenkoists get in a huff, and they get on their high horse, and they start charging at you. Because it's the ideology first. Science is not a discipline. Science is not a discipline that is based off of specific things that you do to gain that authority. It is just a word that means authority, and it is wielded by us because we have the right ideology. That is the Lysenkoist, and I'm surrounded by these people, and I'm surrounded by the propaganda, and it's making my skin crawl. And the ability for anybody to say anything about it is being deliberately undermined by these news sources that I personally don't take part in, but my ability to interact with other news is being throttled by the corporations that allegedly these Lysenkoists and lefties kind of hate or resent, but they're doing a lot of the dirty work, and they're pulling the wool over their eyes. But I think that's what they want. They want somebody to, I guess, just alleviate the stress of having a discerning opinion about anything, and entering into a very dependent state, because they want easy answers, I guess.